A young runner sprints down Lenox Avenue in the dark, carrying folded slips of paper and 20s in his socks. The streetlights flicker orange. 3 numbers on each slip. Dreams for sale on carbon paper. This was Harlem before heroin swallowed the neighborhood whole. If you love stories about power shifting from one generation to the next, about street capitalism colliding with global war, about how money finds new forms when the old ones burn out, make sure to follow, because this one ends with coffins filled with poison and empires built on addiction, crumbling in federal courtrooms. Harlem, New York, summer 1953. The air hangs thick over 116th Street. A woman in a flower print dress walks into a barbershop and hands the owner a dollar bill. She whispers 3 digits. The barber nods. He writes nothing down. The transaction takes 8 seconds. By noon, that same barber will collect 200 more bets just like it. By nightfall, those bets will filter up through a network of runners and bankers to men who control buildings, politicians, and cops. This is the numbers game, the lottery before lotteries were legal. A 3-digit bet based on the last numbers of the day's total handle at the racetrack or the final digits of the Federal Reserve clearing balance or the New York Stock Exchange volume. The odds are 1,000 to 1. The payout is 600 to 1. The difference is profit. Pure, untaxed, unstoppable profit. By 1953, the numbers racket in Harlem generates an estimated $800 million to $1.5 billion annually in economic activity. That is more money than most legitimate businesses in New York City. It employs thousands. It bankrolls restaurants, bars, apartment buildings, funeral homes. It finances political campaigns. It pays for college tuition. It funds church renovations. Every corner store, every shoeshine stand, every beauty parlor is a potential numbers bank. The operation is invisible to outsiders but obvious to everyone who lives there. The police know. The politicians know. The mob knows. Everyone takes a cut. At the center of this system stands a man named Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. Everyone calls him Bumpy, not because of the lumps on his head from childhood fights, but because that is the name that stuck when he arrived from South Carolina in 1919 at age 14. By 1953, Bumpy Johnson is 57 years old. He has survived Dutch Schultz. He has survived the Italian mob's takeover attempts in the 1930s. He has survived prison terms at Sing Sing and Alcatraz. He has made an arrangement with Lucky Luciano that allows him to operate the numbers in Harlem in exchange for a percentage to the 5 families. It is an uncomfortable partnership, but it works. Bumpy controls the street. The Italians control the supply lines and the political protection. The money flows. But something is shifting. The numbers racket, as profitable as it is, has a ceiling. The game is local. The bets are small. $1 here, 50 cents there. The overhead is enormous. You need runners, collectors, bankers, lookouts, lawyers, bail bondsmen. You need to pay off beat cops and precinct captains and judges. The profit margin is stable, but the growth potential is limited. By the late 1950s, younger men in Harlem start asking questions. What if there was a product with higher margins? What if there was something that did not require thousands of daily transactions, but generated the same revenue with a fraction of the infrastructure? The answer is already circulating in the neighborhood. Heroin. The drug arrived in Harlem during World War II, when servicemen brought it back from Europe and Asia. By 1950, there are an estimated 16,000 heroin users in New York City. Most of them live in Harlem, the Lower East Side, and Brownsville. The Italian mob controls the import and wholesale distribution. They bring it in from Marseille through the French connection. They sell it to black dealers in Harlem, who cut it and sell it on the street. The profit structure is inverted from the numbers game. In numbers, the street-level operator keeps a percentage and kicks up. In heroin, the importer and wholesaler take the largest cut. The street dealer takes the risk for the smallest return. Bumpy Johnson watches this and understands the economics. He knows the mob will never let black operators control heroin the way they control numbers. The Italians see drugs as their franchise. They have the international connections. They have the political protection at the federal level. They have the ports and the customs agents and the judges. Bumpy plays the long game. He focuses on numbers. He invests in real estate. He stays out of heroin. It is a choice that will define the next decade. July 7th, 1968. The morning is humid. Wells' restaurant on Lenox Avenue is crowded with the breakfast rush. Bumpy Johnson sits in a booth near the window. He is 62 years old now. He is wearing a grey suit. The waitress brings him coffee, a chicken leg, and hominy grits. He picks up his fork. His hand stops mid-air. He clutches his chest. The fork drops. He slumps forward. By the time the ambulance arrives, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson is dead of a heart attack. He dies under a federal indictment for drug conspiracy. The irony is not lost on anyone. The man who avoided heroin his entire life dies facing charges related to narcotics. His death creates a vacuum. The numbers racket does not disappear, but the organizational structure fractures. The Italian mob moves in more directly. Independent operators scramble for territory. And into this chaos steps a generation of men who watched Bumpy negotiate with the Italians and decided they would not do the same. They would go around them. They would go directly to the source. Frank Lucas is 29 years old when Bumpy dies. He has worked as Bumpy's driver and bodyguard for 6 years. He understands the system. He understands the money. But he also understands that the system is designed to keep black operators at the bottom. Lucas comes from rural North Carolina. He moves to Harlem in 1946 at age 15. By the mid-1960s, he is running numbers for Bumpy and learning the structure of organized crime in New York. He sees how much the Italian mob makes from heroin and how little the street dealers earn. He sees the French connection operating through Marseille. He sees the prices paid at each level. And then he hears about the Golden Triangle. The Golden Triangle is the mountainous region where Burma, Laos, and Thailand meet. It has been producing opium for centuries. During the Vietnam War, heroin production in the region explodes. American soldiers are using. The infrastructure is already there. The supply is endless. The purity is higher than anything coming out of Europe. Frank Lucas has an idea. What if he could bypass the Italian mob entirely? What if he could go directly to Southeast Asia and source his own heroin? What if he could cut out every middleman between the poppy field and the streets of Harlem? 1969. Lucas flies to Bangkok. He makes contacts. He travels into the Triangle. The story he tells later, the story that becomes legend and then gets dramatized in the film American Gangster, involves military coffins filled with heroin being flown back to the United States on Air Force transport planes. The truth is more complicated and less cinematic. Lucas does establish connections in Thailand. He does source heroin directly from suppliers in the Golden Triangle. He does arrange for shipments to be smuggled into the United States, though the exact methods remain disputed. What is not disputed is the purity. Lucas's heroin tests at 10% pure. The Italian mob's heroin from the French connection is testing at 5%. Lucas brands his product Blue Magic. The name spreads. Blue Magic is stronger. Blue Magic is cleaner. Blue Magic is cheaper because Lucas has eliminated the middlemen. By 1970, Frank Lucas is moving heroin through Harlem and into New Jersey at a scale that rivals the Italian mob. He is making an estimated $1 million per day. He keeps the operation insular. He hires family members, his brothers, his cousins, his nephews. He calls them the country boys. He avoids the flashy lifestyle that got so many dealers arrested. He dresses conservatively. He drives a Chevrolet. He does not go to nightclubs. He invests in real estate in North Carolina and New Jersey. He is disciplined. He is methodical. He is invisible. Until he is not. March 8th, 1971. Madison Square Garden. Muhammad Ali is fighting Joe Frazier. It is called the fight of the century. 15,000 people pack the arena. Celebrities fill the ringside seats. Frank Lucas walks in wearing a $100,000 chinchilla coat and a matching hat. He sits in the front row. The coat is floor length. It is unmissable. Photographers take pictures. The images appear in newspapers the next day. Law enforcement sees them. The FBI sees them. The Drug Enforcement Administration sees them. Frank Lucas, who has been operating in the shadows for 3 years, has just announced himself to every cop in New York. While Lucas is building his empire, another man is building his own. Leroy Nicholas Barnes, everyone calls him Nicky. He is born in Harlem in 1933. He grows up on the streets. He uses heroin as a teenager. He kicks the habit in the early 1960s and decides to sell instead. By 1968, the same year Bumpy dies, Nicky Barnes is already moving weight. But unlike Lucas, Barnes does not go to Southeast Asia. He works with the Italian mob. Specifically, he works with the Lucchese and Genovese families. They supply him. He distributes. The arrangement is profitable for both sides. By 1972, Barnes sees the same thing Lucas saw. Why give the mob the biggest cut? Barnes forms an organization called the Council. It is structured like a corporation. 7 men. Each controls a different territory in Harlem and the Bronx. They pool their resources. They buy heroin in bulk directly from suppliers. They cut it and package it themselves. They distribute through a network of street dealers who are employees, not independent contractors. The council operates like a business. They have accountants, they have lawyers, they have enforcers. They launder money through legitimate businesses. They own nightclubs and car washes and apartment buildings. Nicky Barnes is the face of the operation. He is the opposite of Frank Lucas. He is loud, he is flashy, he wears custom suits and drives a Mercedes. He throws parties, he dates models. In 1977, the New York Times magazine puts him on the cover with the headline, Mr. Untouchable. The article details his wealth, his lifestyle, his legal victories. Barnes has been arrested multiple times and beaten every case. He has the best lawyers. He has the best bail bondsmen. He has witnesses who disappear and evidence that gets suppressed. The nickname sticks, Mr. Untouchable. It is a taunt aimed at law enforcement. It is also a miscalculation. The federal government is not sitting idle. The Drug Enforcement Administration is less than 5 years old in 1977. It was created in 1973 by merging several agencies under President Nixon's war on drugs. The DEA is focused on dismantling major trafficking organizations. They are building cases against the Italian mob. They are building cases against the French Connection. And they are building cases against the new black kingpins in Harlem. Richie Roberts is a detective in the Essex County Prosecutor's Office in New Jersey. He is also a law student at night. In 1971, Roberts and his partner find almost $1 million in cash in the trunk of a car during a routine stop. They turn it in, every dollar. This makes Roberts a pariah in his own precinct. Cops do not turn in that kind of money, but it also makes him valuable to federal prosecutors looking for someone they can trust. By 1974, Roberts is leading a task force targeting major heroin distributors operating between New York and New Jersey. The primary target is Frank Lucas. The investigation takes 2 years. Wiretaps, surveillance, informants, financial records. Roberts and his team trace the money. They trace the shipments. They identify the suppliers. They map the network. On January 28, 1975, federal agents execute simultaneous raids across New Jersey and Harlem. They arrest Frank Lucas at his home in Teaneck, New Jersey. They seize cash, drugs, weapons, and financial records. The case is airtight. Lucas is charged with federal drug trafficking conspiracy. The trial begins in 1975. Lucas is convicted and sentenced to 70 years in federal prison. But Lucas has information. He knows names. He knows routes. He knows who in law enforcement is on the take. In exchange for cooperation, prosecutors reduce his sentence. Lucas becomes an informant. He testifies against dirty cops. He testifies against suppliers. He testifies against other dealers. His cooperation leads to dozens of arrests and convictions. It also makes him a marked man. When he is eventually released from prison in 1981 after serving 5 years, he is relocated and placed under protection. He will return to prison again in 1984 on new charges. He will serve another 7 years. By the time he dies in 2019 at age 88, Frank Lucas is a cautionary tale about the cost of cooperation and the myth of the American gangster. Nicky Barnes faces a similar trajectory, but with a different ending. After the New York Times Magazine cover story, federal prosecutors make Barnes their priority. The U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York assigns a team to build a case. They use the RICO statute, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. It was designed to prosecute the mob, but it works just as well against the council. The case takes a year to build. Wiretaps capture conversations about drug deals, money laundering, and murders. Financial records show millions flowing through shell companies. Witnesses agree to testify in exchange for reduced sentences. January 19, 1978. Nicky Barnes is convicted on multiple counts of drug trafficking and continuing criminal enterprise. He is sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The other members of the council are convicted in separate trials. The organization collapses. But Barnes is not finished. In prison, he learns that his former partners have moved on. They are sleeping with his girlfriends. They are not supporting his wife. They have divided his assets among themselves. Barnes feels betrayed. In 1982, he agrees to cooperate with federal prosecutors. He provides information that leads to the conviction of dozens of dealers, suppliers, and corrupt officials. His sentence is reduced. He is placed in the witness protection program. He disappears into anonymity. When he dies in June 2012 at age 78, his death is not announced for 7 years. The collapse of the Lucas and Barnes organizations marks the end of an era. The transition from numbers to narcotics is complete. By the early 1980s, the numbers racket in Harlem is a shadow of what it was in the 1950s. State lotteries are legal now. The street-level game cannot compete. The big money is in drugs. Cocaine is replacing heroin. Crack will arrive in the mid-1980s and reshape the entire landscape again. But the structural transformation that Frank Lucas and Nicky Barnes represented is permanent. They proved that black operators could build independent supply chains. They proved that massive profits were possible outside the Italian mob's control. They also proved that those profits came with consequences that destroyed everything they built. The economic shift from numbers to narcotics illustrates a broader pattern in American underground markets. When one revenue stream is cut off or becomes unprofitable, the infrastructure and expertise migrate to whatever is next. The numbers racket required organizational skills, financial management, political connections, and street-level enforcement. Those skills transferred seamlessly to drug trafficking. The people changed, the product changed, but the system remained the same. Money up, orders down, violence when necessary, silence always. The cultural impact of this transition is equally significant. Frank Lucas and Nicky Barnes became legends. Books were written, films were made. American Gangster in 2007 turned Lucas into a folk hero. Mr. Untouchable did the same for Barnes. The reality was less glamorous. Lucas spent decades in prison and in hiding. Barnes lived under an assumed name for 30 years. The men who worked for them died in the streets or went to prison. The neighborhoods they operated in were devastated by addiction. The heroin epidemic of the 1970s killed thousands. The crack epidemic of the 1980s killed thousands more. The profits went offshore or into the prison system. Nothing was built that lasted. The federal response to the Lucas and Barnes cases established patterns that continue today. The use of RICO statutes to dismantle organizations, the reliance on informants and cooperating witnesses, the targeting of financial networks and money laundering operations, the mandatory minimum sentences that filled prisons without reducing supply. The war on drugs escalated after Lucas and Barnes were convicted. Sentences got longer, enforcement got more aggressive, incarceration rates exploded. But the market adapted, new suppliers emerged, new routes opened, new products appeared. The economics never changed. High demand, high margins, high risk, high reward. The numbers racket to drug trade transition also exposed the limits of political power in poor communities. The numbers game, illegal as it was, functioned as an economic engine in Harlem. It employed people, it circulated money, it funded community institutions. When it collapsed and was replaced by heroin, that economic function disappeared. Heroin extracted wealth. It did not circulate it. The money left the neighborhood. The addiction stayed. The same police who tolerated numbers gambling for decades became the front line of drug enforcement. The same politicians who took money from numbers bankers demanded crackdowns on drug dealers. The moral framework shifted, but the underlying power dynamics did not. Poor communities bore the cost of enforcement and the cost of addiction while the profits went elsewhere. By the mid-1980s, Harlem is unrecognizable from its 1950s counterpart. Buildings are abandoned, blocks are controlled by dealers, crack vials litter the sidewalks. The Harlem Renaissance is a memory. The numbers runners are gone, the jazz clubs are gone. What remains is a street economy built entirely on narcotics and a prison pipeline that empties the neighborhood of an entire generation of young men. The transition is complete. The numbers racket is history, the drug trade is the present, and the consequences will echo for decades. The story of this transition is not unique to Harlem. Similar patterns played out in Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, and dozens of other cities. The specifics varied, but the structure remained the same. Underground gambling gave way to drug trafficking because the profit margins were higher and the market was national rather than local. The men who made the transition successfully were the ones who understood that the rules had changed. Bumpy Johnson operated in a world where political relationships and territorial control mattered most. Frank Lucas and Nicky Barnes operated in a world where supply chains and purity levels mattered most. Both worlds required violence. Both worlds required corruption. But the scale was different, the stakes were different, and the collateral damage was exponentially worse. The federal prosecutions of Lucas and Barnes in the 1970s also marked a shift in how law enforcement approached organized crime. For decades, the focus had been on the Italian mob. The FBI under J. Edgar Hoover was obsessed with the five families. Black organized crime was seen as less sophisticated, less dangerous, less worthy of federal resources. But by the mid-1970s, that perception was outdated. The council was operating as efficiently as any mob family. Frank Lucas was moving heroin at volumes that threatened the Italian mob's dominance. The DEA and federal prosecutors realized that race was irrelevant. The crime was the same. The penalties would be the same. The message was clear. No one was untouchable. The cooperation of Lucas and Barnes also revealed fractures within the black underworld that the Italian mob had managed to avoid for decades. The mob had omerta, the code of silence. Breaking it meant death. Black operators had no equivalent cultural code that carried the same weight. When faced with life sentences, Lucas and Barnes both chose cooperation. They rationalized it. They justified it. But the result was the same. Dozens of men went to prison because of their testimony. The organizations they built were dismantled from within. The Italian mob looked at this and saw weakness. They were wrong. What they were seeing was pragmatism. The system was designed to break you. Lucas and Barnes chose survival. The cost was their reputations and their lives in exile. But they survived. The myth of Frank Lucas and Nicky Barnes persists because it fits a narrative Americans want to believe. The self-made man, the outsider who beats the system, the underdog who outsmarts the establishment. The reality is more tragic. Both men ended up in prison. Both men cooperated with the government. Both men lived the rest of their lives in hiding or under surveillance. The wealth they accumulated was seized. The organizations they built were destroyed. The neighborhoods they came from were left worse than they found them. The heroin they sold killed thousands. The violence they ordered created cycles of retaliation that lasted decades. The legacy is not triumph, it is wreckage. The transition from the numbers racket to the drug trade in Harlem represents a turning point in American urban history. It marks the moment when underground economies shifted from vice to narcotics as the primary revenue source. It marks the moment when local operations became international supply chains. It marks the moment when the profits became so large that the violence required to protect them escalated beyond anything the numbers game ever produced. And it marks the moment when federal law enforcement decided that black organized crime was a national security threat worthy of the full weight of the RICO statute and mandatory minimum sentencing. The economic logic was simple. A numbers runner could make a decent living. A heroin dealer could make a fortune. The risk was higher, but so was the reward. For men like Frank Lucas and Nicky Barnes, who came from nothing and saw no legitimate path to wealth, the choice was obvious. They would take the risk. They would build the empire. They would live the life that was otherwise unavailable to them. They would do it knowing that it would probably end in prison or death, but believing that the years of wealth and power were worth it. That calculation defined a generation. It destroyed communities, and it reshaped American criminal justice policy in ways that are still visible today. By the time Frank Lucas died in May 2019, the world he helped create had evolved beyond recognition. Heroin was back, but now it was fentanyl. The supply chains ran through China and Mexico, not Southeast Asia. The streets of Harlem looked different. Gentrification had replaced abandonment, but the underlying pattern remained. Illegal markets adapt. Suppliers change. Products change. The demand never stops, and someone is always willing to take the risk. Nicky Barnes died 7 years before the world learned about it. He was living under witness protection in an undisclosed location. He had a new name, a new life. No one knew who he was. When the New York Times published his obituary in June 2019, it was the first public acknowledgement of his death. The headline called him a death in Harlem drug law. The story recounted his rise and fall. It mentioned the chinchilla coat that got Frank Lucas arrested. It mentioned the magazine cover that made Barnes a target. It mentioned the cooperation that bought both men their freedom and their obscurity. It did not mention the thousands who died from the heroin they sold. It did not mention the families destroyed. It did not mention the neighborhoods hollowed out. Those stories do not fit the legend, but they are the truth. The numbers racket to drug trade transition in Harlem was not inevitable. It was a choice made by individuals responding to economic incentives within a system that offered limited legitimate opportunities. Bumpy Johnson chose to stay in numbers. Frank Lucas and Nicky Barnes chose heroin. The first choice preserved a community institution. The second choice destroyed it. Both choices were rational within their context. Both led to prison. Both ended in federal court. The difference was the scale of the damage. The numbers game hurt no one. The heroin trade killed thousands. That is the legacy. That is what matters. That is what history remembers when the myths fade and the truth remains. A street in Harlem today. The brownstones are renovated. The sidewalks are clean. There is a Starbucks on the corner where a numbers bank used to operate. There is a yoga studio where Frank Lucas sold Blue Magic. The people who live here now do not know the history. They do not know about the slips of paper with 3-digit dreams. They do not know about the bodies in the alleys. They do not know about the empires built on powder and the prisons filled with men who believed they were building something that would last. The street remembers nothing. The city moves on. The only thing that remains is the pattern. Money finds a way. Power concentrates. The system adapts. And the cycle begins again.